Welcome to the Black Entrepreneur Experience podcast, inside the business, buzz, and brilliance of Black entrepreneurs. Here is your host, Dr. Frances Richards.
Innovative Thinker, episode number 448, Innovative Thinker. Thank you for joining us as we elevate the Black entrepreneur experience by interviewing CEOs, thought leaders, innovative thinkers, and Black entrepreneurs across the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frances Richards. We're excited to have not one, but two guests joining us on the show today. Vickie Lake's battle is all about grant-making to preserve cultural heritage as Executive Director of the Chicago Metro region at IFF. And joining her is Executive Director of Three Walls, Dr. Jeffreen M. Hayes, a public art historian and public curator. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
I've given our audience such a brief bio. Why don't you fill in the gaps and share with our audience what you'd like them to know about your role as executive directors?
So I'll defer to Jeffreen.
Sure. Happy to be here. So nice to meet you, Frances. My role at Three Walls as executive director is to lead the strategic vision for the organization, make sure that our mission is being fulfilled every day. I also set the artistic program at the organization. With that, it is helping to create the programs for the artists, make sure that my team is leading those programs within a set of values that we have organized. And on the administrative side, making sure that the daily operations are going well. And I'm also the principal fundraiser, and so leading the fundraising for the organization.
And within my role at IFF, there are a variety of different hats, but the primary goal is to set the market strategy to advance our goals. Mission fulfillment, so I'm following the lead of Jeffreen here, as well as being proximate to community. A lot of our work at IFF, and I imagine we'll get into it a little bit later, has to do with financial issues, facilities issues, and those are things that many times for organizations that are rooted in community and based in community can seem out of reach. And so a good portion of my work is actually about trying to promote our relevance in the context of community conversations as well as corporate conversations, and making sure, which is a yeoman's task, just trying to make our offerings both relevant, legible, and easily accessible to those that we serve.
So we've seen kind of a shift in terms of, we can look at even in the arts, in the school systems, how important is art and for us to really fund artists and creators?
I'm sure in this instance, Dr. Hayes has a lot to say. So from the perspective as a finance person, I think that the economic value of the arts and the artists and their contributions cannot be overstated. I think that perhaps we've not seen, and we actually struggle to value their contributions. But if you think about particularly certain communities in any urban area, that artists have a tendency to make places and spaces that have long gone desolate or underinvested cool, but rarely do they receive the credit for it. The other thing is just where in urban areas in particular, the artists are culture keepers, culture bearers. The preservation of heritage and legacy, as we really think about this melting pot called the United States of America, the arts and culture organizations are front and center to those conversations because once again, they're creating no barrier and low barrier entry points for all to make contributions.
Yes, artists and the arts are deeply important in our society, particularly in our communities. And one of the things that I think many of us don't realize is that artists also help us to understand the times in which we live. They are also creative thinkers. And so to Vickie's point, in urban areas, artists are using their artistic practices and their creative skills to reimagine, reinvigorate many of our communities, as well as creating art and art spaces that are engaging in the legacy of art and culture that already exists within those communities. So yes, being culture keepers, as well as adding to that legacy. And when we think about over the past few years with the pandemic, art has seen us through much of those dark times.
Let's take a step back in reference to the individual roles that you guys are both doing with your organization. How did you get there?
By accident. So I'm actually a banker by training. IFF supports nonprofits almost exclusively on the premise that they're generally the strongest agents of community change. By way of background, and this probably integrates the role of culture, I was raised by educators, activists, historians. In my household, there was a imperative, a requirement to pay it forward and give back what had been poured into me. I kind of stumbled into finance and banking, working almost exclusively for Black-owned financial institutions. And so I point that out because the deep connectivity to the development of institutions that are formed from a place of lack of opportunity, lack of access to mainstream systems, then they played a role in creating jobs and opportunities for many of us that we would never see. So I went from banking and several different institutions, and I was very interested, as I shared, I was compelled to support the community and began to interrogate, why not? Why is credit or access to capital not being directed to the communities that I'm from, also had the privilege of working in? And so as a former business banker, to be quite honest, this opportunity with IFF to support nonprofits was a big question mark for me. It wasn't natural to, I'm a little smug when I say it, but I was like, well, someone, nonprofit, why would one want to do that? When in reality, I think that when we really deep pull from the places that are deep inside us, that notion, once again, of paying it forward, the notion of giving back really resonated with me. And so I found myself, I'll be celebrating 10 years with IFF actually next week. I found myself actually questioning why I couldn't, this was my can't not do, is support organizations like Three Walls and others that are doing great work in the communities I care about and that I'm from.
I have always had a love of art. I had art in school throughout my public school education, but when I graduated from high school, was going in the direction of sciences and so wanted to become a pharmacist. And that was partially because while I grew up in a household that supported arts and culture, having the arts as a career was not the path. But I took an art history class one summer and I was hooked from that point on. And so decided to follow the kind of art historical path. And as I was exploring different careers I could do, landed with museums. And so decided to become a museum art curator. So I did that for several years. And I still do that independently of Three Walls. And while working in museums, though, I quickly learned that as places that said that they wanted to be inclusive and they were for everybody, I wasn't seeing that on staff, and I certainly wasn't seeing that in terms of the visitors or the exhibitions. And I realized that being a curator is great, helping to build an art collection, getting museums to purchase art by Black artists, helping to build programming to bring Black community members into the museum, but it was a culture within the institution that needed to shift. And being a curator, I realized that I couldn't affect the culture within that institution at that level, and that becoming either museum director or someone in an executive role that could make the decisions to help shift the culture was the direction I wanted to go in. And so after spending, I think, about 10 years in museums, shifted to smaller nonprofits and landed at Three Walls. Three Walls was very much a microcosm of a museum in terms of not doing the work in the way that they said they were in terms of being inclusive. And that's how I landed in the role. The board of directors really wanted the organization to reflect Chicago and the diversity of Chicago. And I honestly did not fully see, obviously, when I was graduating from high school, that I would be running a nonprofit.
And I wanted to say congratulations to you, Vickie, to your anniversary. And thank you for the work that you all are doing. When we look at art and someone's listening and they've taken art out of a lot of the classrooms, what advice would you give to the audience if they have a young person that's interested in pursuing their career as an artist?
There's so many really incredible youth arts nonprofits in many communities that are introducing young people not just to art making, but the possibilities of being a working artist. And so to definitely seek out these organizations within your community, there are some really wonderful ones here in Chicago that do incredible work. And within that, connecting with not just having your child attend these youth programs, but to talk to the staff about other possibilities, connecting your child to a working artist who could potentially mentor that artist. Definitely attend the youth programs at museums, build relationships with those institutions, those individuals. What's wonderful about many of these youth programs, whether they're at a small community arts nonprofit or a museum, artists are teaching those classes. There is a kind of, Vickie was saying, to pay it forward. Artists are very much like that and want to mentor the next generation.
I would add that the arts ecosystem, the arts and culture ecosystem is just vast. And it's one of the few places where the opportunities are limitless. And so as we think about what our youth are encountering, I'm a few days older than 21, but what our youth have access to, what a world that sometimes probably gets ahead of itself technologically. And we need youth to actually find forms of expression I think the pandemic showcased that the role of just the arts even in the mental health conversation. We've seen arts show up. I've mentioned it just when you think about the economic value of the sector, particularly in the BIPOC arts and culture community, there has been this surge where you almost have arts and culture institutions that serve as community hubs and community centers. More often than not, the neighborhood arts organization, its doors are open. And I can't stress enough the willingness of the sector to meet constituents and patrons where they are, as opposed to the pre-qualifications that go with so many things that, if you really think about like our youth, that in so many urban areas, including in Chicago, there's a transactional relationship that they have with generally like the business hubs within any major city. Certainly that's the case with Chicago. If you go back to styles of dress, right, that arts, eliminates the need to put on airs or show up with pretenses and actually celebrates one's identity and permits, it's one of the few places that one's authentic self can actually not only be tolerated, but celebrated. And so I think what we have to do is actually redefine our perspective, and the air quotes thing, the arts, because the limitless possibilities that exist within the sector are why I think that it's integral. I'm really disappointed that the arts is slowly but surely, being removed from just mainstream curriculum for that reason, because it fulfills so many different purposes.
With your respective organizations, you have many success stories. Share a success story that you would like to regarding your organization.
So how IFF really became, partnered with Three Walls is actually through the Chicago Cultural Treasures effort. And that particular effort was a grant-making effort that actually started as an equity initiative that centered arts and culture. Through grant-making, there's technical assistance, there are capacity building supports. You might ask, it's a grant program, but it's far more than that. And then with intentional design, from just open call letters of interest. And this was a funders collaborative where we raised a significant amount of money. It was never intended to be a COVID relief program, and yet COVID happened, and we then had to meet the moment. And so the program itself was launched in 2020 with funding support from 6 different funding institutions, many of which had never worked together in this way. We designed a participatory grant-making program that, again, was just an open nomination process. The letters of interest, I'll tell you that when we first set out to do this work, we thought that we knew the cultural landscape that centered BIPOC traditions in the arts. And we had over 140 letters of expression. And so, if you ever check out our blog, one of the very first posts was that there are no cultural deserts. It's just that we had treasures that some say they were buried, they're hidden, and largely because, as we've stated here, that, our organizations that are particularly entrenched in community are doing the work, not just talking about the work. And so we're really excited about launching an effort that promoted and fostered a sense of community identity and, helped us in a time where we're experiencing twin pandemics, the health pandemic, and then a period of racial reckoning to wrestle with difficult questions. I have to say that IFF is a, financial institution. It is a real estate consultant and a developer. And so it didn't naturally fit within our wheelhouse. And yet I think that in terms of, our flexibility of being a place that our partners could come to, we have an explicit equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative. And so we had to wrestle with hard questions around, okay, could we pull this off? So I say that because I'm really proud of the fact that we did it, right? So the very first thing is that it happened. Unrestricted grants made it into the hands of 40 unique institutions on their terms, and with the goal of trying to learn from the institutions as well as promoting their long-term financial sustainability and resilience. We were able to, and the process still continues to this day, get information, from our partners, hopefully in ways that aren't overly burdensome, with the goal ultimately of influencing the sector around grant making in general, but also the type of resource needs that the arts and culture field needs. So I'm really proud of just saying yes to something where we wouldn't be the obvious partner.
Listing one is so hard because I feel like the story of Three Walls, particularly over the past 8 years, is just one big success story. We are getting ready to enter our 21st year, which is a miracle in itself, I think, for an arts nonprofit. And then when you think about the way that Three Walls has been reimagined into a Black space and being able to sustain over the past 8 years, that is a huge success. And so I am very proud of the intentions that we have been able to set since I've been the executive director. So I've been at Three Walls 8 years now, and being very intentional about not just kind of reflecting Black and Brown folks, but embedding that within the organization and being able to be a signal to many artists locally as well as nationally that an arts organization can really center Black and Brown folks as humans, as artists, as humans, and support them holistically. And being able to say that to our funders, to our community, to artists, and truly practice that. And have folks who in the beginning were questioning it, not because they didn't believe it was possible, but because they weren't sure if it was going to last. And it is deeply embedded within the organizational culture, from the board to the team to our consultants. And so being able to lead that work and truly practice it to where we are attracting artists and community members who finally see themselves is a beautiful thing.
What I'm most excited about the work that you're doing, specifically, I'm here on the West Coast, but I was born and raised in Wisconsin, so I'm deeply rooted in the work that you're doing, as well as I have amazing grandchildren in the Grand Rapids area. So Midwest, my roots are there. What I'm so excited about is you hear a great deal about what's happening in Chicago. And a lot of things that we hear is not necessarily positive. So let's talk about impact and image and the Chicago area. How are you making impact?
There's a lot of texture to that question and a lot of layers. So it's interesting and that you asked that question. It comes up a lot. So I am a native Chicagoan, and I come from Chicago's far south side, where the portrayal on the news is very much not what I experienced growing up. And to this day, what I recall and still exists on the block that I grew up on was a sense of community, a sense of family cohesion, a care and concern where we were neighborly, we were each other's business, we were each other's harvest. A lot of good comes from the community areas on the south side. I was at a conference once and I heard someone say, in order to change the narrative, we have to change the narrator. Again, if you were to ask Vickie Battle about, what she sees when she looks at neighborhoods and communities throughout Chicago, then what Vickie Battle is going to tell you is exactly what what I just said, right? That they're good people, hardworking people that want the best for their children. And I was raised by two single women, my grandmother and my mother. And so, but I lacked for the male presence. I had 9 fathers. Right. So if my bike needed to be tuned up, the question was who was outside tending to their lawn. I think that those particular experiences are missing from the narrative. Who writes the history about this moment? Who documents which voices and which narratives prevail? I think that I'm going to continue to root this back in this notion of culture, right? That I love Black culture and I celebrate it. I was raised by a genealogist, so my arms have been twisted. So I really had to understand what was going on. And I didn't come from junk, right? But we very rarely talked about educational attainment levels. We very rarely talked about careers. We talked about being good human beings and doing the best we could and, earning a day's work for a day's pay. And so I think that I do have a reaction with the narrative about Chicago. Now, the things that are happening in our communities, those things are true. The world is plagued by violence in this moment. I'm curious about, as with others, why the level and the degree of violence and underinvestment is permitted to exist at the levels that it does in certain areas without adequate resourcing to address it. And that's probably a dialogue for another day. So I hope I'm answering your question, but I really do think that it has a lot to do with narrative change. And if we are as proactive about communicating the good things. I mean, there's so much about architecture on Chicago's South and West Side. There's so much about just the history with civil rights, the Great Migration. And it doesn't always have to be the story of lack of opportunity. Actually, our ancestors and those that came here came because of opportunity, and they contributed a lot. And it's on those shoulders that we stand and continue to build.
In terms of impact, what I would say for Three Walls and the work that we do, I mentioned earlier, we take a holistic approach to supporting artists. And with that, that's also thinking about the kinds of programs that we create to center artists and their practice, but also their wellness. We have a wellness circle that is attached to 2 of our fellowship programs. And in that, it is the artists get access to licensed counselor or therapist, a life coach, financial coaching. They get office hours around accessibility with respect to disability to support their programs. And what has been beautiful about that is it was in response to what artists asked us. What we asked them, what do you need besides the funding? We know artists need funding, but what else do you need? And the number one answer was access to a therapist. Being able to offer those services without a cost to them, we cover those costs, has really shifted the way that they move in the world and then their impact in their community, the impact within their relationships. In addition to that, one of the things that we are deeply committed to at the organization and understanding that not only do Black and Brown arts organizations are underfunded, so are the artists, right? We are in a position where we are advocating with our funders, well, you know what, we are going to move to a place of paying artists a living wage, or at least as close to a living wage for the entirety of their relationship with us under contract, right? If we are engaged with them in a fellowship program for 7 months, they will get a living wage for those 7 months. If we're working with them on a special project and it's 2 years, we will pay them as close to a living wage for the entirety of those 2 years. And what this shifts within our ecosystem is this notion that artists should only get paid for the end product. So oftentimes with visual artists, say you're doing an exhibition, you might get a small stipend for materials, and then you'll get modest honorarium for the exhibition. All that invisible labor leading up to that exhibition is not accounted for financially. We have said that actually continues to do a disservice to artists and our sector, and we are going to pay you for your invisible labor over those 2 years. So that means any research you're doing, any ideation, because you can't get to the exhibition or the work of art without that. And that has also also shifted for many artists in our community, the additional income. One of the things that we have learned, for example, an artist we worked with has a full-time job. So many of these artists also are teaching or have full-time jobs, but is a caregiver for their mother. That's an additional expense that their day job may not cover. And so the additional income from Three Walls in terms of this project helps to cover those expenses. So that also goes to the holistic care of artists, and that's the impact. And then the third thing I'll say in terms of that is, well, we do programs in the neighborhoods. So we're no longer a bricks and mortar gallery. We decided to support artists where they live, and the programs would take place in their respective neighborhoods in community spaces, not necessarily art spaces, but spaces that communities have deemed like, this is a safe space for me. And with that kind of approach to supporting art programming and community, the artists get to decide where in their community. They also oftentimes are supporting vendors or small businesses in those communities. And so to Vickie's point, in terms of the economic impact of the arts and culture sector, that's also where it's felt. And so that's the impact that we've been able to make by saying to artists, here's some funding, here's the care, and here is also additional care for your neighbors in your neighborhood through the art programming.
That's amazing. Let's talk about mental wellness and being executive directors.
Yeah, this is one I think about a lot, particularly just given that I'm a Black woman in leadership in the arts sector, and even I'll give more specificity to that, a visual arts sector that is not a museum. And there are very few Black women in leadership in terms of the visual arts at the top in terms of executive leadership. And it can be very lonely. It is stressful when you are thinking about you are responsible for not just an organization, but people, right? And one of the things that I have done to help care for myself is I have a very great support system, a village of folks that I can go to and just vent, and they won't give me advice unless I ask for it, to help ground me and remind me of why I'm doing what I'm doing. The other part is a few years ago, we at Three Walls kind of invested in the mental wellness of the staff in terms of working with a kind of organizational coach, health coach. And that is probably one of the best investments that we've made over the past 3 or 4 years. We work with this organization that caters to Black and brown folk. And when I first started with them, I was having basically every other biweekly check-ins sessions, and then kind of moved to monthly, depending on just like how I was feeling. And now I've moved to kind of just quarterly because I've gained the tools and the space to kind of process. The team also gets sessions with the health coach. We each get individual sessions, then we also work together. We have sessions as a team, and then my co-directors have sessions together with the firm. And so it is deeply important to address the mental wellness of leaders. There's so many brilliant leaders who are in the field and those who have left because of the weight. For me, I think about legacy and leadership development. And so how can we keep folks in the field and also care for their mental wellness? And this is one way we've been able to do that.
So for us at IFF, I think one of the things is that, you can't be compassionate by proxy. And so we have the privilege of not only supporting the arts and culture, the field, but primarily health and human services organizations. I often say that when you're in the business of finance, that you're in an intimate relationship with your partners, because what your mouth says and your money, you're exposed once you put your financial statements out there. There's what you say you prioritize, and then there's the record of where the money was spent. So you get to know what makes other leaders. So as an intermediary, we're in the middle, right? But we get to meet more of the Jeffreens and others on the front lines that are entrenched and embedded in community. And part of the social fabric. So how do we be in right relationship with people and not be concerned with the things that they care about? I think that we've been very intentional over the years about, seeking first to understand and just listening to what really goes on in the day-to-day operations of our partners. I think that's an important point because it's one thing we have to do better jobs of trying things on and not necessarily taking them on. And the reason why I'm framing it that way is because this is the business that we're in, right? So day in and day out, my job is to hear from Jeffreen and others in the areas that she supports. My job is to hear about what youth serving organizations are experiencing. My job is to understand the role of government and for the many compassionate people that occupy public sector roles, social workers, et cetera. What are they concerned with from a policy environment? How do they activate those good ideas in the financial context? And I say that because it's really difficult to try to develop relevant and appropriate responses. I'm not going to say solutions, right? In right relationship and in partnership without certain parts of yourself being exposed and being highly vulnerable. I'll say, just in this context, as an African-American woman, that then there's that, right? So the issues that are associated with race, it's another thing also just with gender and what society says about me. And the fact that in most situations, that is my story. The places and spaces, am I the best practitioner of the things that I talk about? No, but I do think that there are organic partnerships and folks like Jeffreen share their stories about what they're doing. And you're right, there are not a lot of spaces. And I appreciate the language around being lonely because there are very few that have the perspective. There's an overwhelming level of responsibility when you care and you prioritize care for your neighbor. And that's a lot of weight. And yet at the same time, it's such a tremendous privilege. And I try to gravitate towards the bright side of things so that the lows don't get too low.
I want you to have a monologue. I want you to name this person, living or not, and they've impacted your life so much. Who is that person and what are you saying to that person?
I can jump in because my shero was my grandmother. She raised me. Her name was Helen Lawrence Burnett and affectionately called Boots. It's overwhelming gratitude, right? Thank you. I didn't understand at the time, but there was accountability in my household. And she was 4'11", but she was mighty and packed a powerful pinch, both figuratively and literally. And so I just thank her for loving me and for caring so much about me and for her giving of herself and requiring more of me. So I just would have to thank her for that.
For me, it is my mother, who is affectionately called Mama Hayes. She has been the biggest cheerleader in my corner. My mother is from Dominica. My maternal side is West Indian. And I'm grateful that throughout her life that she dreamt, like she was a dreamer, and she was able to pass that dream, that act of dreaming onto me, and has supported me dreaming dreams that she may not have fully understood what they were, always fought for me in school, for me to be on this path. She is my confidant. She is someone who has a really incredible perspective, particularly for someone who is not embedded in the arts and can see things that I don't always see. And I would not be doing the work that I'm doing now and in the place that I am now if it was not for not just her active dreaming, but also her love and care and modeling that for me, pouring into me so that I can pour into others.
If you conducted this interview, what is the one question you would have asked yourself? I'd like you to ask the question and answer it.
Just because, we were talking about release. So I would just say, what makes your heart smile? And I have an expression I tell everyone, I don't even like kids, but I always have a house full. And I even have an 8-year-old best friend. And now my grandbaby, Olivia, who's 6 months. Kids just restore hope and they challenge thinking because they have a perspective, like literally and figuratively, of the world that I think I've forgotten. And they celebrate the little things and help you just find joy in a way that's simple in a world that's so complex. I just have to say it's the little people that I don't want to hug me because they sometimes are cream filled, but they are just delightful and I seek refuge in their company.
I would ask, and this is actually a question that I've been asked before. And when I've been asked, I don't know that I had the answer to the question, but why have you stayed in the field given all that is coming at you or us? And it's much more than love for art. I've stayed because I deeply believe in the impact of artists, and particularly Black artists, to not necessarily affect change, but to honor our history and to build our future and our legacy. And so staying in the field and being able to create, I'll say, the container for them to do that is why I've stayed. I have a deep love for Black people, Black life, Black culture, and Black art. And we continue to need a container for that to exist.
We've come to the part of our interview. It's called Rapid Round of Fun. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'd like you to give me very quick answers. If there's something you desire not to answer, feel free to say pass. Are you ready for the Rapid Round of Fun?
Yes.
Your favorite comfort food?
Mac and cheese.
Cake.
Your ideal car?
Maserati.
I want a chauffeur.
You relax doing what?
Binge watching TV.
Ditto.
Your favorite singer or rapper?
Snoop.
Missy Elliott.
Your favorite dance song?
I wobble.
The Tamia line dance.
What food you eat every week, no matter what?
Tacos.
Shrimp tacos.
Your favorite month?
October.
June.
Vickie Lakes Battle, Dr. Jeffreen Hayes, thank you so much for joining us on Black Entrepreneur Experience Podcast. Before we let you go, share with our audience the best way for them to connect with you and to learn more about the work that you're doing. Feel free to leave all your social media handles.
So you can learn more about IFF at iff.org. And for the Chicago Cultural Treasures work, you can reach out to us at chicagoculturaltreasures.org as well.
To learn more about Three Walls, you can follow us on Instagram at _3 walls, one word, _. Also our website at 3, spelled out, THREE-walls.org. And you can learn more about my work on Instagram my handle is Dr. Arts Culture Girl, all one word, Dr. Arts Culture Girl.
Thank you. That's a wrap.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to Black Entrepreneur Experience. We would love for you to leave a review and rating on iTunes and share with your friends. For show notes and more episodes, go to www.beepodcast.com. Join us next Wednesday, and remember, green is the new black. So keep your bank accounts and your business in the black.